Hi there, it's the Eco Freaks podcast. I'm your host, David Robert Lewis, and we have in our studio a woman who's been involved in GM campaigns, anti-GM campaigns, environmental activist Chloe Menteith. But before we have a chat, Chloe, I just wanted to update our listeners as to what happened over the festive season. I just recently attended the Learning Man, Learning Clan EcoFest out at Riffiesonde End. A lot of interesting people, tree hugging, meditating, a lot of vegans, vegetarianism, getting back to nature. I was quite inspired by what was happening, an effort to get out of the consumer society, using the talent as a means of exchange instead of the rand. Very interesting market space, people sharing their produce, exchanging it using this new currency. So I spent a couple of weeks there in the bush. Got back a couple of days ago. I'm still adjusting to living back in the city. So Chloe suggested that we do some kind of a podcast, get the ball rolling on some environmental activism that's coming up over the year. And before we go into the issue that's you're familiar with, it, which is GM, I thought maybe we should speak a bit about the water crisis, because I've come home to find that Patricia de Lille is in the process of being unseated. A lot of people angry and irate because of the water restrictions, blaming her essentially for her style of management. Chloe, what are your views about the water restrictions? Do you think they are required? This whole thing about day zero, in 6 months we're going to run out of water. What are your views about the water situation?
Well, it's not really 6 months. Okay, it's a little bit sooner than that. That they are projecting that the entire city will run out of water.
Right. So the Theewaterskloof Dam seems to be it's lower than 19% full, even though there have been rains. Why is that? Why are the dam levels so low? There's been a bit of rain over the.
Let's steer out of the political and the chaotic and the reactionary, and we talk more about how we would respond to an ongoing drought crisis.
Right.
Why are the dams? Rainwater catchment begins at the top of the mountains. There's only so much water catchment on the landmass of the planet. So in the mountains of the Western Cape, where we have strategically positioned dams to catch this water, there were once healthy forests and healthy ecosystems. Much of this sort of thing has been disrupted. The water that we've drained from the rivers, springs that fill into these dams, we've mismanaged it. And we've deforested the area, and what's happened is the silts will rise and the water quality will become lower. All sorts of water catchment issues arrive. Too much evaporation.
Yes.
When you're in desertification means that there's more water evaporating every year than is sinking into the soil. I mean,
Right.
this is what we're fighting against.
One vector of
in many places that had dry lands to start off with, like the Western Cape, up the coast to Namibia, the western part of Australia, the western part of the Americas,
right,
all have a drought zone, really.
Yeah.
So it's always going to be an issue for those people, and this is where the water crisis is first going to hit. It's what we see today.
Yeah, Chloe. Well, the thing is, I've written about this issue quite extensively. I've got a chapter in a book edited by Mpele Rampele, and where about 20 years ago, a lot of this was science that was predicting that the Western Cape would become more arid as a result of the shift of weather patterns, that the peninsula is losing its Mediterranean climate as a result of climate change. And we've now gotten to that point where it seems to be a fact of life. We're moving towards the new normal of no water, being where the peninsula is becoming very much like the semi-arid desert, like the Karoo. And given that, what is it that we need to be doing to mitigate climate change, to reduce this catastrophe that seems to be in our near future and also long term? There seems to be a catastrophe that we're hurtling off the cliff, reaching a tipping point. And I really want to discuss some of the science, but maybe you can give us input about how to save water, or
to touch on just as an understanding about climate, moderating of climate and the effects on the climate. There is a greater effect on the climate coming from the CO2s being released into the atmosphere in an already very, very drought sensitive zone that already has a continental climatic effect, causes it to be a dry zone already. So we're facing the problem first. Other people may see climate change affecting their lives in the form of floods. Other people may see it in the form of giant hurricanes. Basically, the climate is going to become more and more volatile, with less and less moderating effects like forests.
Right.
You know, this is core. This is one of the ways they've kept saying we can offset our carbon.
But isn't this the problem of thinking that we can trade our way out of the situation?
We weren't talking about trading as the environmentalists. We were talking about planting trees.
Yeah.
We were talking about protecting forests.
Right.
This had nothing to do with buying your way to ecological heaven. And sadly, clean environments, clean water and clean food are becoming only available to the rich, who will probably build artificial environments to coster themselves in, while the rest of the poor on the earth will live in a very low standard of living. It probably still with an increasing population, and it's not looking good.
Well, a lot of the talk around COP17 happened when was it, 2011? It's now 5 years. How many years ago later? It's 2018. So 7 years later, we still digesting some of that information. A lot of climate scientists came to South Africa to give us their research and share their findings. And at that point, people were talking about a 2-degree change becoming or being interpreted in Africa as a 7-degree change, that it's not going to be an even 2 degrees everywhere on the planet, that there are these regional differences, and that yes, the poor would experience greater reality of not being able to adapt to the climate shift that is occurring, and yes, the rich perhaps being in a better position to afford mitigation. What needs to be done to prevent climate change, Chloe?
I don't think there's anything that can prevent climate change at this point. What the scientists have said, based on existing factors that affect climate, big continental climatic patterns and things, obviously different places are going to experience this differently. And what the scientists said was that at 2 degrees all the rainforests burn, for example. At 3 degrees, all the temperate forests burn. And at 4 degrees, we're hitting a situation where all the amphibians on the dry land masses have died out. Horrifying kind of projections like that. I mean, I can't remember exactly what they were telling us. Okay, but what they were meaning was once the permafrost begin to melt, there's a whole bunch of methane trapped there. Then that methane is going to be released, and then it's going to get another degree hotter across the planet. And of course, that's an average. When you're talking about the equator, it's got a relatively constant temperature, especially where there are forests. And then at the ice caps, a temperature change is a little bit different. So overall, we're going to have these differences, and then obviously if ice melts in places, we're going to have a cooling. We're going to have a cooling in some areas. In some areas, we're going to have very volatile temperatures, and this is just we're less certain of things when we've disrupted massive systems that were in fine balance, and there was biology involved. It's what animals and plants breathe in and out. There was a lot of things holding the balance of this big system, and it has been so severely wrecked that no, I don't think there's anything we can do to stop climate change. We're going to have to figure out how are we going to grow food if the planet's 4 degrees warmer? Where are we going to live? How will we get water? And how will we keep our civilization? Because there's another aspect to this is the fundamentals of eco-politics is that people have a right to know about the earth, about their rights, and the rights of future generations. That's where it is essentially also a humanist, political sphere. And as the planet becomes more and more disrupted, and we have major events like this, we're running out of water, and the leaders of Cape Town will be verging on what we would describe as eco-fascists. Under an army, when they're rationing out water, they're having to control various zones of movement of their citizens. And in order for the people to not panic, even hush stories of outbreaks of panic among any members of the population. So we've got this is what we see in the far future. We see a rise of eco-fascism as the last type of political system we'll ever have on Earth.
Right. Well, the resource wars that we have doomed future generations to as a result of the decisions which have been made over the last 2 decades, as we lose the habitat that defines us as human beings. And what concerns me is the loss of habitat becomes extremely volatile. There have been these mass extinction events in our distant past. 250 million years ago, there was an event called the Great Permian Extinction, which occurred, wiped out 75 to 95% of all living creatures on the planet. And similarly to what is going on now, there's been it started off as a CO2 event, then caused by basalt eruption. Our CO2 is predominantly the result of industrialization and the use of fossil fuels. But complicating this scenario was the release of methane hydrates trapped at the bottom of the Earth's oceans. And most scientists, if you look at the data online, you find that there's enough CO2 at the bottom of our oceans, in fact more than the entire reserve of natural gas and fossil fuels on the planet as we speak. So the complications which are caused as a result of the global warming, climate change, and the thermal expansion of the Earth's oceans, some of the information that the Department of Oceanography is one of the sub-department clusters under the Department of Environmental Affairs, what they've been reporting on is the 1 to 2 degree warming of the Southern Ocean. So perhaps we also need to shout out to the South African Antarctica expedition. I understand one of the headlines over the weekends was that there's some problem to do with relief of that expedition, where they're low on supplies, and there was a problem with one of the members, caused as a result of friction over food. Just a sort of a little bubble of what we're going through in Cape Town, where there's friction over water. Perhaps you could comment on this, Chloe.
Yeah. Well, you went back to COP 17? I remember that we had the Earth Summit around 2000. There have been a number of these big conferences, and there have been a lot of people discussing how this is going to look. There was a definite relationship to conflict and resource depletion and habitat destruction, big weather events, and what we were going to see is environmental refugees.
Right. Right.
And so that's like the extreme major, all the humans are going to have to move, like 20 million of them, to some other place, and then that's going to really put pressure on where they're arriving, and our habitat is humans, and how we share it among ourselves, our social political systems.
All right, so
and then
our future,
there's
right?
the micro politics of probably in people's neighborhoods. There's probably people walking around being little eco-fascists and water fascists and phoning or being hypocritical.
Yeah.
And then there's like the more upper classes in Cape Town that have done all this water-saving things and blah-de-blah-de-blah, but they haven't done anything in the townships. And so there's a little bit of a lot of people are not in reality about the resource. It's great to put blinders on and say it's somebody else's fault.
Right.
It's Patricia DeLille's problem.
It's her problem, right?
It's a DA issue. Whatever. It's all of these foreigners. It's all the tourists.
Right.
It's all somebody else's fault. It's never about us each taking responsibility and mobilizing ourselves in our own capacity.
Well, perhaps I can unpick some of that for our listeners. So on the one issue would appear to be hegemony or power relations that define us as a society, our decision-making processes, our leadership, our structures where we make those decisions about resources, creating conflict. And what you refer to as, I guess, an emerging fascism that people obviously get riled up about. We don't want to know that we have to restrict our living standards. We don't want to downgrade our lifestyles from flush toilets to eco-friendly toilets. We don't want to have to restrict our diet. And yet everything's seeming to suggest that we're moving into a future of no water, environmental refugees, crisis points, flash points. That's the one dimension. The other dimension, obviously, our national strategy as a country to deal with climate change. And perhaps I could just unpick that if you wish. Listeners might know that the program that we've got as a country is known as Peak, Plateau and Decline, where because we're an emerging market, we're a developing country, we've decided that we're going to ramp up our CO2 production, building new coal power plants to get on parity with the West, while the West obviously is reducing their consumption. And only in a few years, in the near distant future, we're going to then obviously peak at a point and then start to decline in our CO2 emissions. the question in my mind is, do we have the leeway? Do we have time, given that we're already now experiencing a crisis point as a result of lack of water caused directly by climate change? Is this policy a sane policy for the kids of the future, Chloe?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look like enough is actually being planned for what we're going to be facing. I believe people are going to be unprepared for things.
Right.
I myself have lived for years on 87 liters of water. Long ago, I cut down on my resource use. First, I had a very privileged upbringing and was surrounded by maybe even an overload of resources.
Right.
In terms of what the planet can give and what we could share among ourselves as humanity. So I've tried to downgrade my lifestyle in scale with what the environment can actually provide people. So I'm used to 87 liters of water. I've also lived in some very poor areas where people use far less water.
Right.
So water for me, well, I already restricted my water to what they're telling us that we have to in order to offset this day zero.
Right.
Yeah, so that's.
But isn't it
just on a personal level?
My reaction is, hang on, this is unacceptable. I don't want to live in a future of no water. I don't want to. That's not the reality that I wish to abide by. I'm someone who I would rather let's figure out a way out of climate change instead of trying to live with climate change and adapt. Surely there's a limit to what we can adapt to. If we're going to end up in a future where there's increasingly less and less water, where there's the coming resource wars, surely that's a non-negotiable. There's a point where we say, hang on, so far and no further, where we've got to actually take action, where the personal, yes, is political, and our individual choices and decisions do affect the system. But at what point do we all get together and say, hang on, we've got to defend Mother Earth, and we have to have a major policy shift, and in fact we've got to put pressure on other governments as a country. If it's not just us, it's also every other nation state on the planet, and there's some serious polluters out there. And why is it that we're one of the top polluters on the globe? Why are we contributing massively to greenhouse gases? What point do we become militant eco freaks as opposed to complacent eco freaks, Chloe?
Yeah, well, I don't know, Dave. I don't know how much longer we're supposed to take it.
Right.
It seems that there's a mass depression. Most people that live in these big cities where we're mismanaging and scrambling up really well processed products of nature into like a big mixed up heap, a mess, like a trash site. It's like incredibly complex ecological functions and materials that took millions of years to be produced and things like that, and then you just kind of grind them haphazardly into a machine and churn it around for a while, and it lets off some interesting, food or interesting thought processes or interesting makes of cars or whatever. But then what's on the other side is pollution. What's pollution?
So directly, what is this a party political issue, or is this something greater that perhaps there's on a human level? If we are
that carbon's pollution.
Well, any greenhouse gas is part of that pollution cycle, and if the problem, as science tells us, is the we've over 400 parts per million CO2, that we've seemed to be peaking with our carbon emissions, and that given that there's going to be complications caused as a result of those emissions, surely the best defense is to mobilize around this issue, that it's not just water that is the crisis, it's the atmosphere which is the crisis point.
This is what I mean, is this is what I think maybe people don't fully understand what pollution is. Maybe we could just define.
Let's talk about pollution, if that's your entry point to this discussion.
It's the entry point because maybe the connection between these systems is not visible to people, because here we're talking about, we breathe out carbon monoxide, we little bit of a fire, why? So what's the big deal? Why is that pollution?
Right.
So you get different kinds of pollution, and what, when you define something as pollution?
Well, there's a healthy cycle that's part of the natural life cycle, where CO2 is our friend, but then there's an unhealthy
parts per million.
And then there's a point where there's an unhealthy CO2. There's an unhealthy greenhouse gas effect caused by industrialization, and if we keep ramping up that vector of emissions, the result are complications that we haven't figured into a lot of our planning. The day zero scenario of no water in the city of Cape Town is just a wake-up call. So I have a slightly more dystopian view of the future, that not only are we heading towards a future of no water, but we're heading towards a future of massive habitat loss. And when I talk about habitat, I'm not talking about the birds and the bees. I'm talking about human habitat, and I'm talking about the end of the Anthropocene, the period of geological time marked by human intervention in the environment, that's rapidly coming to a close. Bearing in mind that there have been several mass extinction events in geological history, and one of them that I was trying to relate, which I find quite fascinating, was an event happened 250 million years ago, known as the Great Permian Extinction. Now, if that is what we're heading towards, a catastrophic breakdown in our habitat as a species, the habitat that defines us, where mammals and the great apes and human beings exist, what is the future, and what are the scenarios? Well, one of the scenarios that I've been banding around since COP17 for the last 8-9 years has been one where we end up under domes, under the bottom of the oceans. We end up in artificial habitats created because we completely lose the atmosphere, which becomes volatile and subject to massive change of the kind which happened during these several extinction events. That's what people aren't talking about. We in denial that there's a water crisis, and we're uncomfortable examining issues to do with greenhouse gases. So to get back to the water issue, because water is part of the climate, it's part of our the weather patterns, which are massively changing, caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Do you think it's fair to say that Delil isn't relating the full nature of the crisis, that she's been very selective in the way that she's presenting the water problem as merely an issue to do with Theovatus Kloof, and it's merely to do with an issue of rainfall in the peninsula? Is it that she's not being completely honest in the way that she's dealing with the crisis, Chloe, that she should perhaps be relating some of the climate science, and there's a whole dimension that we haven't dealt with that makes her seem a little bit like an eco-fascist?
Well, you know what? I think that science is not something that everybody can just go into, understand. So that's why political leaders and people like Delil wouldn't actually be explaining to people much about the climate science. I think that the only way these people really understand anything is through the law, you know, in almost like a legal language.
It's a rights
okay,
issue.
Yeah, this is the only place that that seems to be able, where it can like sink in a little bit, because you can't keep bombing everybody with all the science.
So it's a rights issue. My right to water is being violated by someone else's equal right, and it's a negotiating tactic. Why should the rich have water and the poor go without? What is the generally accepted conditions? You know, in terms of how many liters, and it becomes a contestation point. But if we're not tackling the reason why we're having this conflict in the first place, surely it's a disconnect between the climate science and the water. Yes. I don't know what would be a good term. It's the one-sided water trip that people seem to be on. And is there a way to communicate some of this knowledge that is out there, to ask questions and to be critical? That when people start telling us that there's a problem to do with lack of water, and that there's a shift happening as a result of the weather, why we're not discussing why that is so, and how that's linked to the environment.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I think there's that level. Why is there no massive mobilization to get us into more safe like habits? Why are people resisting it so much? Well, that's a whole question. I mean, why is the world so unjust and all this? That's a more deeper philosophical question.
Is it a little bit overwhelming?
That I don't know. That everybody, that's quite subjective. But the other thing is, okay, how do we permanently inhabit the Earth as a species?
Right.
What people tell us is that we're a young species. We haven't actually been here that long, in geological time especially. Right. And so we haven't yet found our little niche in the whole system. And there were other species that have disrupted the environment and caused the extinction of a whole lot of other species. This has happened before as well in the Earth's history. So maybe let's not be like too. So
we reach 9 billion individuals out there, and each one consuming.
We were a species. We expanded our populations quite rapidly, and we changed these systems on the Earth, like the carbon cycle.
Right.
You know, but we have to look to the future. Okay, right. We're a species that can change the carbon cycle.
Right.
There didn't seem to be any other species that were able to radically alter the carbon cycle, just like one kind.
Yeah.
So then we're living in a neurotic state as humans, where we see ourselves somehow separate from the whole Earth. We don't have a place. You know, we were born with this kind of problem when we came into the world. We were humans with the Anthropocene. Everything about what we're doing seems out of sync with the natural patterns.
Right.
Who are the Anthropocenes? What are we doing here? These are very deep existential questions, actually, and very deep philosophical questions. But in everything in this whole environmental history, since I was brought up in environmentalism, my mom followed environmentalism very closely. She was a vegetarian as well.
Right.
She raised me that way.
Yeah, and you've chosen
to
not eat meat.
Yeah. We would pick up. I don't eat meat.
Right.
I still don't eat meat. when we would go to the forest and then we pick up other rubbish. You know, we didn't just take our own rubbish. I was raised to be very aware of the environment and stuff, and you always come back to planting trees.
Right.
Always in all of in the books that I've read about the ecology, and my studies into permaculture, everything is leading to the same thing. So it seemed trees and forests seem to be linked to our culture, or our culture meaning a far more like earth. We seem to have originated from forests. This is what paleontologists and all these people that study early man say. We sort of populated all the other continents out of Africa, and we were living in these forests, and that's where we come from.
Return to the original source of things,
that's
right?
our proper habitat. We're meant to be in forests.
Yeah.
And we have destroyed a whole fifth of the forest or something like that already.
Well, there's a species destruction at a rate of knots. So we're losing thousands and thousands of organisms every year. And a lot of this stuff, it's a steady stream of facts and information. And so I spent a couple of weeks in the forest. I come back and it's back to living in my city habitat, where there's a switch off, and I'm just questioning the way forward. So I think we're going to continue this conversation. Obviously, we're not going to deal with this in a short space of 20 minutes, but if you enjoy what you've been hearing and you want to continue, please drop us a line, send us an email, drop a Skype. Eco Freaks podcast, where we talk about anything environmental, whether it's tree hugging, GM foods, climate change, forests, tree people live in forests, people want to go primitive, naked in the bush, all of that stuff, and hopefully we can decode some of the politics around it, and the leadership involved in making choices and decisions. We are the system is us, and we need to definitely get to grip with what is happening in Cape Town. So I think that's all for today. I'm going to bid listeners adieu and goodbye until next week. Eco Freaks podcast. Chloe, you want to say goodbye?
Yeah, I want to say goodbye and just hope that you can hear our message.
Right. Thank you.